She tied the last of her belongings to the roof of the old hatchback with trembling hands. The morning sun, still soft and golden over the quiet street. It wasn't much, a few boxes of books, a second-hand dresser wrapped in a faded quilt, and a potted fern that had survived 3 moves already. But it was hers. And today, it was all heading to what her husband had called our fresh start. He'd been so excited when his parents first mentioned the house. "It's been in the family for generations," he'd said, eyes bright like a kid on Christmas morning. "They want us to have it." She remembered how his voice had cracked slightly, like he couldn't believe his own good fortune. And honestly, neither could she. At 28, with student loans still hanging over her like storm clouds and rent eating up most of her paycheck, owning a home even, a run-down one, felt like winning the lottery. The in-laws had handed over the keys at a small backyard lunch 2 weeks after the wedding. His mother had smiled tight-lipped and said, "It just needs a little love." His father had barely looked up from his plate, nodding once like it was a chore they'd finally offloaded. She hadn't thought much of it then. She was too busy imagining fresh paint, curtains fluttering in open windows. Maybe a vegetable garden out back. Now, standing in the overgrown driveway of the house for the first time. Alone, her husband, still at work, she felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't disappointment, not exactly. More like unease. The house loomed in front of her, tall and silent, its white paint peeling like sunburnt skin. One shutter hung crooked. The front porch sagged like it was sighing under the weight of years. The lawn was a tangle of weeds. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something else, something forgotten. She stepped inside. The floorboards groaning under her boots. Dust danced in the sunlight that strained through grimy windows. The kitchen sink had rust rings. The living room floor was littered with dead leaves that must have blown in through cracks she couldn't even see yet. Every room echoed with emptiness, and not the peaceful kind. It was the kind that made you feel watched, even when you were alone. But she wasn't one to back down. She'd grown up fixing things, mending clothes, patching drywall in her aunt's old duplex, even rewiring a lamp once with help from a library book. So she rolled up her sleeves the very next day. She bought drop cloths, paintbrushes, sandpaper. She scrubbed floors until her knees ached. She pulled weeds until her hands were raw. She hung string lights in the backyard just to chase away the gloom. Her husband came home each evening, tired but supportive, bringing takeout and offering to sand the banister or patch holes in the walls. For a while, it felt like they were building something real together, something more than just a marriage, but a home. Then the visits started. His parents began showing up unannounced, always on weekends. Always when she was knee-deep in paint cans or elbow-deep in grout. His mother would stand in the doorway, arms crossed, making comments like, "Oh, you're still working on that?" Or "You really think that color suits the room?" His father rarely spoke, but when he did, it was usually something dry like, "Hope you've got deep pockets. This place is a money pit." At first, she brushed it off. Maybe they were just old-fashioned. Maybe they didn't understand the joy of restoring something beautiful from ruin. But then the tone changed. The comments got sharper. One Saturday, as she struggled to pry loose a warped floorboard in the hallway, his mother leaned against the doorframe and said, almost casually, "No one's lived here in over a decade. Guess they all realized it wasn't worth the trouble." She laughed lightly, but the sound didn't feel warm. It felt like a test. Another time, while she was planting marigolds near the front steps, trying to bring a little life to the place, his father walked past without stopping and muttered, "Waste of time. Nothing ever grows well here." She tried to laugh it off. She told herself they were just being protective of their family home, that they didn't mean any harm. But each visit left her feeling smaller, like she was playing dress-up in a life that didn't belong to her. And then there was her husband. The man who'd held her hand during thunderstorms and whispered, "You've got this." When she doubted herself, he started echoing them. "You sure you want to spend so much on new cabinets?" he asked one night, frowning at the catalog she'd left open on the kitchen table. "Maybe just clean the old ones." "It's not like anyone's coming over," he said another time, when she mentioned inviting friends for a housewarming. "Besides, it's still kind of a mess." She stared at him, fork halfway to her mouth. "I thought you liked what I was doing." "I do," he said quickly, but his eyes darted away. "It's just, maybe don't expect too much too soon." That night, she lay awake long after he'd fallen asleep, listening to the house creak and sigh around her. For the first time, she wondered if it was the house that was broken or something else. She began noticing little things. How his phone buzzed more often on Sundays, his mother's weekly check-in, he said. How he'd grown quieter during dinner, scrolling through real estate listings just for fun, even though they'd just moved in. How he never defended her when his parents made those barbed little remarks, not even with a look, not even with silence. One rainy Tuesday, she came home early from work with a sinus infection, hoping to rest. She found his parents in the living room with him. They hadn't called. They never did. His mother was holding a measuring tape like she owned the place, pointing at the ceiling. "She really thinks she can turn this dump into something," his mother said, not even lowering her voice. "I give her 6 months before she gives up." His father chuckled. "Lest, if she's smart." Her husband didn't say a word. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor like he hadn't heard. She stood frozen in the hallway, heart slamming against her ribs. Part of her wanted to march in and demand an explanation. Another part just wanted to curl up and disappear. But instead, she turned around, walked back out into the rain, and sat in her car until her clothes were soaked through. That was the moment she realized she wasn't just fixing up a house. She was trying to prove something. To them, to him, maybe even to herself. And they weren't just mocking the peeling paint or the sagging porch. They were mocking her. Her effort, her hope, her belief that love and hard work could build something lasting. Still, she didn't quit. Not yet, because deep down, beneath the hurt and the doubt, was a stubborn spark, the same one that had carried her through late night. Study sessions and lonely holidays, and every time life tried to tell her she wasn't enough, she kept sanding, kept painting, kept planting flowers that probably wouldn't bloom. But now every brushstroke felt like defiance. Every nail she hammered in felt like a quiet "I'm still here." She didn't know it yet, but the house held more than dust and broken pipes. Somewhere beneath the layers of neglect, there was a secret one that would unravel everything she thought she knew about her in-laws, her husband, and the gift they'd so generously given her. But that truth was still buried. And for now, all she had was her 2 hands, her tired heart, and the echo of laughter that didn't include her. What she didn't realize was that sometimes, the thing that feels like your biggest failure, the place where you're mocked and doubted, is exactly where your real strength begins to grow. And in the silence of that crumbling old house, something inside her was starting to change. Not because of what they said, but in spite of it. Copy rain drummed against the roof like impatient fingers tapping glass. It had been pouring all morning, a kind of steady downpour that turned the backyard into a swamp and made the old house groan even louder than usual. She'd woken up with a headache and a fresh layer of mildew creeping up the bathroom wall. But she wasn't about to let another day slip by without making progress. So she pulled on her oldest jeans, tied her hair back, and got to work in the master bedroom, the one room she'd barely touched since moving in. The walls were covered in decades-old floral wallpaper, yellowed and peeling at the edges like old bandages. She'd decided to strip it all away, hoping to find solid plaster underneath. 2 hours in, sweat sticking her shirt to her back, despite the chill, she tugged hard on a stubborn strip near the baseboard. It didn't budge. She knelt, running her fingers along the seam. And that's when she felt it a slight give in the floorboard beneath her knee. Frowning, she pressed down. It shifted just enough to make a soft creak. Curious, she grabbed a flathead screwdriver from her toolbox and carefully pried at the edge. The wood lifted easier than she expected, revealing a dark hollow beneath. Her heart thumped once, not from fear, but from that quiet thrill of discovering something hidden. Inside was a small metal box, rusted at the corners but still tightly sealed. She pulled it out, wiped off the dust with her sleeve, sat cross-legged on the floor, rain still whispering through the window behind her. The box opened with a reluctant squeak. Inside, protected by layers of oilcloth, were a stack of yellowed photographs, a few brittle newspaper clippings, and a small leather-bound journal. The handwriting on the spine was faded but elegant. Eleanor, 1968. She flipped it open, careful not to tear the fragile pages. The ink was brownish, the script looping and personal, like someone writing to a friend rather than keeping notes. The first entry read, "They think I don't know what they're planning, but I do. And I won't let them ruin this family's name or steal what's meant for others." Her breath caught. She read faster. Page after page told a story she never knew existed. Eleanor, her husband's grandmother, had discovered her own son and daughter-in-law were running into serious money troubles in the late 1960s. Instead of asking for help, they'd started secretly selling off family land, forging documents, even taking loans against properties they didn't fully own. Eleanor had tried to stop them, but they pushed back hard. So she made a quiet plan of her own. She'd rewritten her will not to leave the big house to her son, as everyone assumed, but to donate it to a local women's shelter. "It's too big for one family," she wrote, "and too full of good bones to be wasted on greed." But before the paperwork could be finalized, she fell ill. And in her final weeks, weakened and watched closely by her own child. She'd hidden the truth in this very room, hoping someone would find it someday. One entry sent a chill down her spine. "They call me senile now. Laugh when I speak. But I see everything. That house was never theirs to give. And if they pass it on to someone else under false pretenses, may the truth rise like water through cracked stone." She sat there for a long time, rain tapping the roof, the journal resting in her lap like a weight. It wasn't just old family drama. It was a warning, a confession, a plea. She flipped to the back of the journal and found a folded piece of paper, a copy of the original will, signed and notarized, dated just 3 weeks before Eleanor died. In clear terms, it stated the house was to be transferred to St. Agnes Women's Aid upon her death. There was also a handwritten note. "If you're reading this, you've been given a lie. Don't carry it forward." Her hands shook now. She'd thought the cold remarks, the sneering comments, were just cruelty. But what if it was more than that? What if they'd given her this house because it was trouble? Because they needed someone else to take the blame or the debt off their hands? She grabbed her phone and called the local county records office. After 20 minutes on hold, a kind-sounding clerk helped her look up the property's history. What she heard made her stomach drop. The house had never been fully cleared through probate. There were 2 outstanding liens, one from an unpaid contractor in the 90s, another from a property tax dispute in 2005 that had never been resolved. And according to the file, the deed transfer to her and her husband had been rushed through with incomplete documentation. In legal terms, it was messy. In real terms, it meant she might not even legally own the place. She sat on the edge of the bare mattress, staring at the empty closet across the room. All this time, she'd thought she was being tested, mocked for her effort, laughed at for caring. But the truth was worse. She'd been set up. Not just emotionally, but financially. That gift came with hidden strings, tangled so tight they might never come undone. She wanted to confront her husband right then. But she knew he'd dismiss it. He always did. "You're reading too much into things," he'd say. Or worse, "Why can't you just be grateful?" So she didn't say a word that night. When he came home, she smiled, asked about his day, served the soup she'd made. But inside, her mind was racing. If the house wasn't truly theirs, if the in-laws had known about the liens, if Eleanor had tried to stop this exact thing from happening. She stayed up late, scanning every page of the journal with her phone camera. She took pictures of the will copy, the newspaper clippings about local property disputes from the 1970s. Even the faded photos most showed Eleanor standing proudly in front of the house, garden trowel in hand, smiling with women who looked like they'd just been handed keys to a better life. One photo had a note written on the back: "St. Agnes Girls, 1969. They stayed here for 6 weeks while their shelter was being repaired. Good souls. Deserved more than the world gave them." That night, for the first time in months, she didn't feel small. She felt like she'd found an ally, someone who'd seen the same trap and tried to warn future generations. The next morning, she called a real estate attorney, recommended by a friend from work. She didn't say much over the phone, just that she'd inherited a property with possible title issues and needed advice. The lawyer agreed to meet. At the appointment, she laid everything out: the journal, the will copy, the county records. The attorney, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and silver hair, read through it all in silence. Then she looked up and said, "This changes everything." She explained that if Eleanor's final will was legitimate, and it appeared to be, then the house was never legally the in-laws to give. That meant the current deed might be invalid. Worse, the liens could mean the county or creditors could eventually force a sale, and neither she nor her husband would see a penny. But there's more, the lawyer added gently. If they knowingly transferred a property with undisclosed debts and false ownership claims, that could be fraud. The word hung in the air like smoke. She walked out of the office feeling dizzy, but not from fear. From clarity? That weekend, while her husband was out running errands, she went back to the house with a flashlight and a crowbar. If Eleanor had hidden one box, maybe there was more. She checked under floorboards in the hallway, behind loose bricks in the fireplace, even inside the old pantry shelves. Nothing. But then she remembered something from the journal. I always kept my truths close to the light. She climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, a space she'd avoided because it smelled of mice and rot. Dust hung thick in the air. Sunlight sliced through a broken window, illuminating floating particles like tiny stars. In the far corner, tucked beneath a moth-eaten quilt, was a small wooden chest. Inside were more documents, bank statements showing large withdrawals by her husband's parents in the early 2000s. Correspondence with a real estate attorney who'd warned them the deed was legally precarious. And even an old insurance claim from a fire that had never actually happened. The paperwork was faked. The claim was denied, but not before they tried. She sat on the dusty floor, legs numb, heart pounding. This wasn't just carelessness or bad luck. This was a pattern. They'd been doing this for years, using the house, and probably other properties, to try to dig themselves out of debt. No matter who got hurt, she thought about all the times they'd laughed at her efforts. All the jokes about her wasting time. They weren't just being cruel. They were watching her pour her money, her energy, her hope into something they knew might collapse beneath her and her husband. He might not have known the full truth, but he'd chosen their side every single time. Even when it hurt her. That evening, she made dinner like always. But when he walked in, she didn't ask about his day. She sat him down at the kitchen table, the same one she'd sanded and stained herself, and laid out a single page, a copy of Eleanor's will. "Read this," she said, her voice steady. He skimmed it, frowning. "What is this? Some old paper?" "It's proof that this house was never theirs to give us," she said, "and they knew it." He laughed, short, nervous sound. "Come on, that's crazy. Grandma's been gone for 30 years. You can't take some scribbled journal as legal evidence." "I already spoke to a lawyer," she said quietly, "and the county records match what's in here." He went still. Then his face tightened. "You went behind my back?" "No," she said. "I went looking for the truth because no one would tell me." Stood up abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "You're making something out of nothing." Again, always looking for reasons to be upset. But his voice didn't sound sure. It sounded scared. She didn't argue. She just watched him pace, watched the doubt flicker across his face, the same face she'd once trusted without question. Later that night, long after he'd gone to bed, she sat on the back porch with a cup of cold tea, listening to the crickets. The house loomed behind her, dark and full of secrets. But for the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a witness. Eleanor had tried to protect someone she'd never meet. And now that someone was her, she didn't know what came next. Legal battles, a fight with her husband, maybe even leaving the house behind for good. But one thing was clear: she wasn't the fool they thought she was. And she wasn't going to let their lies bury her, not in this house, and not in her life. Somewhere in the walls, floorboards settled with a soft sigh, like the house itself was breathing easier. The truth was out, and it wasn't going back in. She didn't sleep much that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the lines of Eleanor's handwriting. the faded ink like a voice whispering across decades they're lying. And worse, her husband's face when she showed him the will. Not anger, exactly. More like panic wrapped in disbelief. Like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar, pretending he didn't know it was off-limits. The next morning, he acted like nothing happened. Made coffee. Kissed her on the forehead. Asked if she wanted a ride to work. But the air between them had changed. It wasn't warm anymore. It was careful. Like they were both walking on glass, afraid to crack what was already fractured. She stayed quiet. Not because she was backing down, but because she needed time. Time to think. Time to plan. She'd already learned the hard way that throwing accusations around only made him retreat further into his parents' version of the story. So instead of shouting, she started listening, watching, documenting. She kept a small notebook in her purse, dates of visits, exact words spoken, even tone of voice. She saved every text message, every email about the house. She took photos of the property as it was, day by day, proving how much work and money she'd already poured into it. She even recorded a short video of the sagging porch with her phone. Voice calm as she described the rot, the missing support beams, the way rain pooled in the crawl space. It felt strange at first, like she was preparing for war in her own life. But she kept reminding herself this wasn't about revenge. It was about protection. Protection of her future, her dignity, maybe even her sanity. A few days later, she saw him on the phone in the kitchen, voice low. Yeah, I don't know what got into her. She's got this idea in her head that the house isn't really ours. No, I think she's just stressed. You know how she gets when things aren't perfect. Stood in the hallway, out of sight, heart pounding. You know how she gets. As if her concerns were just another mood swing. As if the truth was something she'd imagined because she couldn't handle reality. That night, she waited until he was asleep, then quietly pulled up old family photos on his laptop, just to see if there were any clues. Any hints about Eleanor or the house? She wasn't snooping out of spite. She was searching for cracks in the story, she'd been told, and she found something. Tucked in a folder labeled Grandma Stuff was a scanned letter from a lawyer dated 2018, 5 years ago. It was addressed to his parents. The subject, notice of probate. Irregularity property at 382 Willow Lane. The letter stated clearly that the transfer of the house after Eleanor's death had never been formally approved by the court, due to missing documentation, and that the property remained in legal limbo until resolved. He knew, or at least he'd seen it. Maybe he'd forgotten, or maybe he'd chosen to forget. She closed the laptop slowly, hands trembling not with anger, but with a deep, quiet sadness. It wasn't just his parents. He'd been part of the silence all along. The next Sunday, his parents showed up again, a call, no warning. His mother carried a casserole dish like a peace offering. His father lingered by the driveway, eyeing the new trellis she'd built for climbing roses. Well, look at you, his mother said, setting the dish on the counter. Still playing handy woman? She didn't smile. Someone has to. His mother raised an eyebrow. You're not still upset about that old journal nonsense, are you? Honestly, I'd throw that thing away if I were you. Full of confused ramblings from a woman who didn't know what she was signing at the end. I read the county records, she said evenly. And the 2018 letter from your lawyer? The room went silent. Even his father turned around, his expression shifting from casual to sharp. His mother's smile didn't drop, but her eyes turned cold. I don't know what you think you found, she said, voice smooth as ice, but that house is yours. Be grateful for it instead of digging up ghosts. I'm not digging, she said. I'm just asking why no one told me about the liens, or the probate issue, or the fact that Eleanor wanted it to go to a women's shelter. His father stepped inside then, closing the door behind him with a soft click. That's enough, he said, voice low. You're overstepping. No, she said, meeting his gaze. You overstepped when you handed me a house you didn't legally own and let me spend thousands fixing it while laughing at me the whole time. Her husband stood near the hallway, frozen. He didn't defend her, but he didn't defend them either. For the first time, he looked. torn. His mother's voice rose slightly. We gave you a home, and this is how you repay us? With accusations and conspiracy theories? It's not a theory, she said. It's paperwork. It's truth. Truth. His father let out a dry laugh. Truth is, you wouldn't have a roof over your head if it weren't for us. And now you're acting like we did something wrong for trying to help? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at them, the polished shoes, the calm confidence, the way they stood side by side like a fortress. They'd spent years building this story, and they weren't about to let one over-emotional daughter-in-law tear it down. But then something unexpected happened. Her husband cleared his throat. Maybe you should have told her about the liens, said quietly. All three of them turned to him. His mother's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? He wouldn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the floor. I saw that letter, Mom. The one from the lawyer. Years ago. I didn't think it mattered because you said it was all sordid. His father stepped forward. It was sordid. Legally complicated, but sordid. We didn't want to worry you two with old paperwork, but it wasn't sordid, her husband said, voice gaining strength. Because now there's a lien for back taxes. And another one. And she's the one getting bills. Silence fell like snow. His mother's face tightened. You're choosing her version over ours? He didn't answer right away. Then, so quietly she almost missed it. I just want to know what's real. It was the smallest crack. But it was enough. After they left, his mother muttering about ingratitude, his father slamming the car door harder than necessary, her husband stayed in the kitchen, hands in his pockets, staring out the window. I'm sorry, he finally said. For what? She asked, not unkindly. For not listening. For believing them over you. She didn't hug him. Didn't say it was okay. But she poured 2 cups of tea and set one in front of him. I don't want to fight your family, she said, but I can't live in a lie. He nodded slowly. I know. That night, they sat up late, not fixing anything, just talking, really talking, for the first time in months. He admitted he'd always sensed something was off about how eager his parents were to give them the house. They never gave away anything without wanting something back, he said. I just didn't want to believe it was true this time. She told him everything: the attic chest, the fake insurance claim, the pattern of financial trouble. He listened without interrupting, his face growing grayer with each detail. The next day, he called his parents and told them he needed space. No yelling, no drama. Just, we need to figure this out on our own. They didn't take it well. His mother left 3 voicemails. His father sent a single text. You'll regret this. But he didn't reply. Meanwhile, she reached out to a local community center that supported women in tough housing situations. She mentioned Eleanor's journal, the will, the shelter connection. To her surprise, the woman she spoke to got quiet. St. Agnes Women's Aid closed in 1984, she said. But we absorbed their records and their mission. She asked if they still had Eleanor's file. Yes, the woman said. And there's a letter in it from Eleanor herself, explaining why she wanted the house used for shelter. She even offered to host women there temporarily years before she died. They arranged to meet. A week later, she sat in a sunlit office holding a photocopy of that letter, signed in the same elegant hand as the journal. In it, Eleanor wrote, a home should be a refuge, not a weapon. If my family ever uses this house to control or deceive, I hope someone finds this and sets things right. Tears welled in her eyes. Not sad tears, relieved ones. She wasn't crazy. She wasn't imagining things. She was part of a story much bigger than herself. She showed the letter to her husband that evening. He read it twice, then sat on the edge of the bed, head in his hands. All this time, he whispered, I thought I was protecting my family, but I was helping them hide. She sat beside him. It's not too late to do the right thing. He looked at her, eyes red-rimmed. What do we do? We get help, she said. Real help. Not just legal, but people who understand how families like yours operate. She'd heard about a nonprofit that helped people navigate complex family property disputes. Especially when elder influence or financial manipulation was involved, they offered free consultations. They went together. The counselor, gentle man with a calm voice and decades of experience, listened without judgment. When they finished, he said, "What you're describing isn't uncommon. Families sometimes pass down problems along with property, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it." He connected them with a lawyer who specialized in property fraud and elder financial abuse. Not to sue yet, but to understand their options. As they walked out of the office, her husband squeezed her hand. "I don't know how you stayed so strong," he said. "I wasn't strong at first," she admitted. "I cried every night for weeks. But then I realized this house wasn't the enemy. The silence was." He nodded. "Then let's break it." Back home, they started making real plans. Not just about the house, but about their life. They talked about whether they even wanted to stay if the legal mess got too deep. They discussed renting for a while, even moving towns. For the first time in a long time, they were on the same team, and though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: the mocking had stopped. Not because the in-laws had changed, but because she'd stopped believing their lies. Now, the truth wasn't just something she'd found in a box. It was something she was building, one honest conversation, one brave choice at a time. The town hadn't held a community meeting in years. Most folks figured nothing important ever happened in a place this small, just quiet streets, familiar faces, and the occasional lost dog poster on the grocery store bulletin board. But when word got out that someone was challenging the long-standing property claims of the Whitmore family, people started paying attention. It started with a phone call from a local reporter. She'd met him by accident at a coffee shop while waiting for her lawyer. He'd overheard her talking about liens, forged deeds, and a hidden journal from the 1960s. At first, she didn't want to talk to him. She feared being painted as a bitter daughter-in-law stirring up drama. But he listened without interrupting, asked thoughtful questions, and most importantly said he'd seen similar patterns before. "Families like this," he told her gently, "they don't just do it once. They keep doing it until someone stops them." That stuck with her. So she agreed on one condition: no sensational headlines. Just facts. Just truth. Over the next few weeks, the reporter dug into public records. He found 3 other properties the in-laws had gifted over the past 20 years, each one burdened with unpaid taxes, contractor liens, or disputed ownership. In 2 cases, the recipients had quietly walked away, losing money and credit in the process. In the third, a cousin had filed a lawsuit that quietly settled out of court. It wasn't just about her. It never had been. Armed with this new information, her lawyer filed a formal petition with the county court to declare the deed transfer invalid due to misrepresentation and lack of clear title. She didn't sue for money, not yet. She asked for one thing: clarity. Who really owned the house? And if it wasn't her in-laws, then who did? That's when things got real. Her in-laws didn't respond with words this time. They responded with lawyers, expensive ones in dark suits, who sent letters full of legal jargon and veiled threats. One letter accused her of emotional extortion and attempting to destroy a family legacy. Another implied she was mentally unstable, citing her obsession with old documents. But she didn't flinch, because now she wasn't alone. The women's advocacy group she'd contacted, the one that had absorbed St. Agnes, stepped forward. They still had Eleanor's original donation agreement, signed and notarized. And though the shelter had closed, their nonprofit status meant they could legally claim the property as part of their historical assets. Even better, a retired judge who'd known Eleanor personally came forward. He remembered her well. A woman of fierce kindness and sharper principles, he said. He wrote a sworn affidavit confirming that Eleanor had spoken publicly about her wish to leave the house to the shelter, and that her son had argued bitterly against it. Then came the neighbors. One elderly woman, who'd lived across the street for 50 years, brought over a shoebox of old photos and a handwritten log she'd kept of every time repair trucks or inspectors showed up at the house. They always said they owned it, the woman told her over tea, but the city would come, ask questions, leave. Never saw them fix a thing. Another neighbor, a retired contractor, admitted he'd been hired in 2003 to do roof repairs, but never got paid. "They told me the house was in probate," he said, shaking his head. "Said I'd get my money when it cleared. I never did." Piece by piece, the truth stopped being just her story. It became the town's story. The local historical society found records showing that the house had been flagged multiple times for code violations. Violations the in-laws had ignored, while still collecting property tax breaks as owners. And then, the final blow, the reporter uncovered an old insurance investigation from 2007. The in-laws had filed a claim for fire damage that never occurred. The case was dropped due to lack of evidence, but the file noted suspicious patterns of claims on multiple properties. When all of its slander's journal, the will, neighbor statements, contractor debts, insurance records, and the Historical Society's findings was presented to the county's legal review board. The result was swift. The deed transfer was declared void. The house had never legally belonged to the in-laws after Eleanor's death. Therefore, they had no right to give it away. The property reverted to the estate which, per Eleanor's documented intent, would now be managed by the women's nonprofit in her honor. Her in-laws didn't show up to the hearing. They sent their lawyer, who argued for reasonable reliance and good faith transfer. The judge, a no-nonsense woman appointed just last. "You're shut it down fast. You can't give away what you don't own," she said plainly. "And you certainly can't mock someone for trying to care for something while hiding its broken foundation." After the ruling, there was no dramatic shouting match. No tears in the courthouse hallway. Just a quiet walk outside. The sun warm on her face, her husband beside her, holding her hand like he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. That evening, the women's nonprofit held an informal gathering in their small community room. About 30 people showed up. Neighbors, former shelter residents, local historians, even a few curious reporters. She didn't plan to speak, but when the director asked if anyone wanted to share, she stood up. She didn't rant, didn't accuse. She just told her story, how she'd been handed a house like it was a gift, how she'd tried to love it back to life, how she'd been laughed at for caring, and how she'd found a journal that changed everything. "I didn't do this to hurt anyone," she said, voice steady. "I did it because silence helps the wrong people." And someone had to speak for Eleanor. Afterward, a woman in the back stood up. She'd stayed at St. Agnes in 1981, fleeing an abusive marriage with 2 toddlers in tow. "Eleanor let us sleep in that house for 6 weeks," she said, voice thick. "Gave us soup, clean sheets, and a place where no one could find us. That house saved my life." The room fell silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Soon, the whole room was applauding, not for her, but for Eleanor. For truth, for the idea that a home could be more than wood and nails. It could be a lifeline. Her in-laws didn't speak to her or her husband after that. No calls, no letters. They sold their own home quietly and moved to towns over. People said they kept to themselves now. No more dinner parties. No more generous gifts to young couples. As for her and her husband, they didn't get the house back, and they didn't want to. The nonprofit offered them a surprising deal. Stay in the house rent-free for 1 year, while they decided what to do with the property. In return, they'd help document its history and assist in planning its future use. They said yes, not because they wanted to live there forever, but because they wanted to help turn it into what Eleanor always meant it to be. During that year, they hosted small workshops, home repair basics for single moms, financial literacy nights, even a letters to Eleanor wall where people could leave notes of thanks or hope. The rose trellis she'd built, it bloomed wildly, climbing the porch like it finally had permission to grow. Her husband changed too. He started volunteering with the nonprofit, helping with repairs on other transitional homes. He apologized, not just once, but often, for not seeing what was right in front of him. "I thought loyalty meant silence," he told her one night as they painted the kitchen together. "But real loyalty means doing what's right even when it's hard." She believed him, because actions had replaced words. And though the legal battle was over, the real work had just begun, healing, rebuilding trust, and proving that a place once used for deception could become a place of safety. One afternoon, as she swept the front porch, a young woman with tired eyes and a duffel bag walked up the driveway. She'd been referred by a domestic violence hotline. The nonprofit had offered her a room for a few weeks. "Is this really free?" the woman asked, hesitant. "It is," she said, smiling. "No strings. Just a safe place to breathe." The woman looked around at the blooming garden, the open windows, the warm light spilling from the kitchen. "It feels like hope," she whispered, and in that moment, standing on the porch of a house that had once mocked her, she finally understood the shocking truth hadn't just changed everything. It had given her a chance to help change things for someone else. 2, 3 years later, the front porch didn't creak anymore. The steps had been rebuilt with pressure-treated wood, the railings sanded smooth and painted a soft sage green. Pots of lavender and marigolds lined the edges, not just for color, but because their scent helped calm nerves, something the residents especially loved after long, hard days. She sat on the glider with a mug of chamomile tea, watching the late afternoon sun stretch golden across the yard. Inside, 2 women were cooking dinner together, laughing over a recipe one had learned from her grandmother back in Guatemala. Down the hall, a third was helping a little boy with his homework, her voice patient and kind. The house hummed with life, not the heavy kind from before, when silence felt like judgment, but the warm, messy, hopeful kind that comes when people finally feel safe. They called it Eleanor's Refuge now. Not a grand name, but a true one. It hadn't happened overnight. After the nonprofit officially took ownership, they held a community vision session. Dozens of people showed up: shelter staff, local counselors, former residents, even a few teachers from the nearby school. Everyone had ideas. Some wanted a full shelter. Others suggested a counseling center. But the strongest voice came from a teenager who'd stayed there briefly after leaving a violent home. Just let it feel like a real home. Not a place people pass through. A place they belong. Stuck. So instead of dorm-style rooms, they kept the layout mostly intact: cozy bedrooms with real beds. A shared kitchen where meals were cooked together. A living room with mismatched couches and shelves full of secondhand books. The nonprofit handled funding and oversight, but day-to-day life was run by a small team of live-in coordinators, women who'd once needed a place like this themselves. She wasn't on staff, but she still came by almost every day. She helped with the garden, fixed leaky faucets, and sometimes just sat with someone who needed quiet company. Her husband worked full-time as a carpenter now, and half his projects were pro bono: repairing windows, building shelves, reinforcing porches for other safe houses in the county. People often asked if she regretted the shame, the months of being made to feel foolish. She never did, because without that pain, none of this would exist. She remembered the first time she brought a new resident through the house. The woman had been quiet, shoulders hunched like she expected to be turned away. When they reached the master bedroom, the same one where she'd found the metal box under the floorboard, she paused. "This was mine once," she said gently. "Now it's yours." The woman looked around at the fresh quilt, the clean windows, the small vase of wildflowers on the dresser. Then she touched the windowsill as if testing if it was real. "It feels like someone cared." "They did," she said. "And they do." That was the heart of it, really. This wasn't just about shelter. It was about dignity, about proving that a person's past doesn't have to dictate their future, that a broken place, whether it's a house or a life, can be rebuilt with care. One spring morning, a group of high school students came to volunteer as part of a service project. They painted the shed, weeded the garden, and even built a small bench under the old oak tree out back. Their teacher pulled her aside afterward. "I've never seen them this quiet," she said, nodding toward the kids. "One of my students whispered to me, 'If this is what hope looks like, I want to build more of it,'" she smiled. That was the ripple effect she hadn't expected. The house wasn't just changing lives inside its walls. It was teaching an entire community what compassion looks like in action. Her husband often said the same thing. "I used to think strength was standing your ground," he told her once, while they repaired a fence together. Now I know it's having the courage to admit you were wrong and then doing something to make it right. It grown in ways neither expected. He no longer flinched when his parents' names came up. He'd sent one letter, years ago, saying he forgave them but couldn't trust them. They never replied, and that was okay. Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed again, just acknowledged and left behind. As for her, she'd found her voice not loud but steady. She started speaking at town events about housing justice, about how property can be used as both a weapon and a shield. She never blamed, she just shared, and people listened. One evening, a local filmmaker asked to interview her for a short documentary about women rebuilding after betrayal. She agreed, but only if Eleanor's story was included during the interview. Sitting on that same porch where she'd once cried in the rain, she said something that surprised even her. I used to think I was the victim of a cruel joke, but now I see was the answer to a prayer Eleanor whispered 50 years ago. The filmmaker paused the camera. That's beautiful. Can I use that? She nodded. Just make sure you show the garden too. That's where healing starts, sometimes before we even know we need it. Life settled into a rhythm. Mornings with coffee and quiet planning. Afternoons filled with small repairs and bigger conversations. Evenings with shared meals and stories that didn't need fixing. Just listening, the house still had quirks. The back door stuck in winter. The old furnace groaned before it kicked on. But those weren't flaws anymore, they were reminders. Reminders that nothing good comes without effort. That love isn't just a feeling, it's showing up day after day, even when it's hard. On the anniversary of the court ruling, they held a small gathering. No speeches, no banners. Just lanterns strung along the porch, a potluck dinner, and a memory table with Eleanor's journal open to a blank page. Residents were invited to write one sentence about what safety meant to them. One wrote, "Safety is locking my own door and knowing no one will knock to hurt me." Another, "Safety is my daughter laughing without fear." Third simply drew a heart. She stood by the table, watching as people added their words, and felt a quiet peace settle deep in her bones. This was more than redemption. It was rebirth she never imagined. Back when she was scrubbing grime off kitchen tiles and swallowing hurtful comments, that this would be the outcome. She thought she was just trying to save her marriage, or prove she wasn't a fool. But really, she was planting seeds in cracked soil, seeds of truth, of courage, of stubborn hope, and look how they'd grown. Sometimes, in the stillness of early morning, she'd walk through the empty hallway and pause outside each room, listening to the soft sounds of breathing, peaceful, unguarded. That's when she felt it most. The weight of what had been lost, and the lightness of what had been found. This house had once been a trap. Now it was a threshold, not just for the women who stayed there, but for her too. Because through it all, she'd learned the most important lesson of all. You don't have to be given a home to build one. You just have to believe it's possible and be willing to lay the first brick yourself. One summer evening, as fireflies blinked in the garden and music from a neighbor's radio drifted over the fence, she sat with a new resident on the porch. The woman had arrived that morning with nothing but a backpack and a worn-out pair of sneakers. Did it always feel like this? The woman asked, looking around. Like peace, she thought for a moment. No, she said honestly. It used to feel heavy, like it was watching me fail. But houses don't have feelings. People do. And when the right people fill a place with kindness, the walls start to change. The woman nodded slowly, then smiled, a real one, small but sure. Then I guess I'm in the right place. She reached over and squeezed her hand. You are. Later that night, long after the house had quieted and the moon hung high above the oak tree, she stood at her own window now in a small cottage, just 2 streets over, that she and her husband had bought and fixed up together. She looked back toward Eleanor's refuge. Its windows dark, but its presence strong against the night sky. She didn't need to live there to know it was alive. She could feel it in her bones, and the way her heart no longer clenched when she thought of that driveway. That front door, those creaking stairs, the mockery was gone. Not because the people who spoke it disappeared, but because their words had lost their power, and in its place, something far louder, laughter, cooking smells, drifting through open windows, children's drawings taped to the fridge, 100 quiet acts of courage, happening every single day. The abandoned home hadn't just been saved. It had become a sanctuary, and she once mocked, doubted, and nearly broken had helped make it so. Not with grand gestures, but with stubborn love, not with anger, but with action, not by running away, but by staying long enough to turn pain into purpose. As she turned from the window, she realized something simple but true. The most powerful stories aren't about winning, they're about becoming, and hers was still being. Written one healed heart, one safe room, one blooming garden at a time.